Hi, my name is Benedict for Higher Hertz. We are looking at IK Multimedia's Sample Tank, number 4 this time. Now, Sample Tank goes back a pretty long way. From vague memory without fact checking, I think it's probably somewhere in the early 2000s that some of the first instances of Sample Tank came out. I will, as always, be quite forward in that it never really appealed to me. There was a certain percentage of people who were like, sample tank, sample tank, sample tank. And that's great. It was working for them. I was always going in a different direction. I was interested in pure synthesis. But at the same time, if you look at my videos on, say, purity, I was always open to the fact that there was a weakness in Dorville with regards to the rompler, the idea of having this one keyboardy thing that gave a good working set of all sounds. And Sample Tank set itself out to be one of those. I don't think they were the very first. I don't know who would have been the first. A few people had a decent stab at it. Giga Sampler, I think, being one of the earlier that kind of succeeded, but back then, hard drive size, delivery size, as in how many megabytes or gigabytes of data, all of these things were difficult. But Sample Tank managed to grab a certain part of the market. And I think that regardless of how they present themselves, they've always kind of majored on that part of the market. And good on them. They've got a clear sense of who they intend to serve. But I'm not sure that they are as clear with the market as to who they serve. But that said, the market probably don't want to be at least consciously told you're being put into this stream rather than that stream. So when Toyota sell a Corolla, they will talk about their racing heritage with the impression that maybe somehow that Corolla is really a Lamborghini, a Ferrari, a world rally champion. All of these things are embedded in the Corolla experience, when in reality we all know that a Corolla and a Ferrari are not quite in the same stream. So I see Sample Tank now still as being more in the, if we were to use keyboard terms, I think that they are far more Yamaha Portasound as opposed to Yamaha Pro, so like an MODX or whatever, or if we're talking similar sorts of things, which is very easy to see, it's more of Casio Tone Bank kind of approach and that kind of streaming than the real Yamaha Roland Korg kind of professional product that that's really played by real musicians. You don't see stage guys, serious stage guys who are playing on top line bands. Let's pick somewhat at random. Occasionally there's keyboard stuff happening in Iron Maiden. I'm relatively confident that the keyboard player, who's generally hidden behind a curtain, is not playing a Yamaha Portatone or a Casio Tone Bank. He is probably playing what we call a professional piece of kit. And I think that Sample Tank is focusing on that level of the market, which is fine, but it does mean that it is not the same as the kind of stuff that I have focused my career on. That said, let's try to be fair. So we'll run through a couple of demos. You may well recognize the pieces because they are taken from former reviews. This first one, that you might recognise as being the Addictive Drums thing. So of course there's the immediate question is, how do these drums compare to Addictive drums? Well, kind of as is the nature of everything with Sample Tank, yeah, they're okay. Is there that level of bombast and excitement that there is in the Addictive samples? No, not at all. Is that a problem? Well, it depends what you're doing. If you are trying to pitch material that is at the, let's say, Iron Maiden level, what with them having been at the top of their part of the industry for, 40 years or something or other, Sample Tank's not there. It's not pitched at it. But if you are after a box that can give you a whole pile of sounds that are good enough to do scratch work, then yeah, this will do the job just fine. And yes, the sounds are nicer than those in Purity, but the reality is that, let's say Purity is, because it's very cheap, the entry level, then Sample Tank sort of sits above that, but then there's a fair gulf between that and what we might say is Iron Maiden level. And in that gap is not nothing, because you have things like, well, one of the last reviews that I did was of Spitfire. It was one of their originals at 29, and yes, it's only a choir, but they're the Spitfire Labs. The downside is that they're a little bit higgledy-piggledy, and they're not sort of as much in one box, but once you've got a few of them, then the Spitfire thing sort of gives the impression that they're a little bit more in one box, but they're not as cutely, safely, sedately delivered as a Sample Tank, and that convenience is a merit. Here's the original. And that was just made in a real hurry with presets out of the Reasons sound bank, and I would never have said it sounded particularly great, but I just wanted to give the drums here some purpose, Addictive in that case, and they are nice and bombastic. We've got a bright, clear sound. If we pitch backwards and forwards, the Sample Tank actually almost seems nicer, but the problem that you will face moving forward is that the Sample Tank stuff will always sound the same. You can do what you can, but especially if working in the everything that you need for one song, which is a big part of the Sample Tank promise or sales thing, that you find that it doesn't really move outside of that sound. It's kind of got a nice, safe, warm, in this case quite laid back compared to the kind of hard-hitting sound that we get there. So it's kind of like becomes a cover band compared to the original guys. Now, revoicing is tricky. It's always tricky, especially when faced with the inability to get kind of matching sounds. I did have some difficulties getting this done, but a lot of that was sort of my fault because I haven't done this in Reaper. I'm having to do this in Reaper because Reason doesn't support multi-timbral instruments, as in one instrument with lots of bits of MIDI sent to it. But that's the only way for us to test the Sample Tank gives you everything you need in one box to make a cool rockin' song. So I moved across. I was silly enough to follow somebody's process on their YouTube. Probably should have looked at Kenny Joyer. But it made a mess. So I kept having to dig out of the mess that was made. So I thought, look, let's be fair, because there was a certain amount of frustration that boiled into this. So let's be fair and have a go at another one. This is the piece that was done for Algorithm, Reason's super cool FM synth. And initially I was going to be like, I was always going to reuse this for something, but I sort of thought it was probably not for Sample Tank because it's a bit too outside of. So we have our original. They're really kind of driving and hard. it comes out quite strangely because this just doesn't have the breadth of sounds. Partly that's because I'm using the CS version, or the free version, and while they say there's 50 sounds to cover all the things you need, there are not. Body to November, hunting man, body, show fossils, and the Arctic cycle. It was a lovely day, death lost in part, disease, bosses, This obviously provided some difficulties, which were anticipated, but I thought, okay, let's see. A, is easier to do than I first did? Yes, it is, so long as you don't try to make it easier to do by using the right-click, make Reaper do this, that, and the other for you. Do it by hand, and it will be easier. You won't have the problems that I had. That's in terms of dragging in this MIDI file and assigning it to instruments. There were also some limits with regards to, sure, obviously having to make unusual sound choices, like replacing a lot of synths with brass parts, but it was the only sounds that remotely played the role properly. I used 2 drum kits, but you'll see it's kind of strange looking here. There is no bus mixing. So while technically, yes, you can mix tracks without buses, if you're wanting to get some of the effect that you get out of buses, then you have to fudge the system. So to do that, I moved the drums and bass to a pre-send rather than a post-send, sent them to bus 2 when everything else is going to bus 1 just for a pretty bog standard reverb, and then compressed all those parts. But it was a lot of trial and error, and then there was no way from this bus to send to the reverb. Therefore, I had to do what to me is always pretty well a no-no of duplicating the reverb from here to here when it shows or doesn't show, or I don't know. Sometimes this. Oh, there we go. So there are some inconsistencies in GUI behavior. So I duplicated the reverb. So they're at least got the same type of reverb, but they're not pushing into the same reverb, which creates some little issues, as does the fact that the vocals are not able to go through this. There is no audio in to bring the vocals up on this mixing desk, meaning that the vocals don't go through the same effects, let alone to the same place, which is a little bit of a problem when mixing, because you'll find that things never really gel together. But the result was interesting. To say it was wrong would be incredibly wrong, but do we end up with something that represents what I was trying to do at the beginning? Well, kinda no. But I made these sounds in the mix specifically to be this way, so not 100% fair, but at the same time, if they're saying you've got everything you need, well, sorta do. And we've got a result. And if these were the only sounds that I had, then I would have built going, okay, that's all I've got, as I did here, and sort of said, okay, well, that's the best fist I can make of this. But at least without the options for more specialist sounds, this would have impacted on what was made quite big time. So it's one of those things you're going to have to kind of work out whether it's the right path. In no way do I want to be taken that I'm being negative about the product, but I'm always looking at a product like this, any product, every product that I look at from the perspective of being a beginner, because I always was when I started, and to some extent I will always be a beginner, not because I'm a beginner, but because I'm always learning. 30 years on, I know so much more than I did, but I also always try to be really open to new or different things or new or different ways. So therefore, I kind of have to be a bit like, is this really going to get people where they need to go? And as I say, you've got really rough and ready sounds in Purity, but will mix up quite well. You've got these which are nicer, but possibly with a noose. And then you've got putting together bits and pieces, like labs or wherever else you might be getting your bits and pieces from to put together your kit. The latter is the way that I was trained, that there is no one-size-fits-all solution. The company themselves, IK Multimedia, as I say, they started out with this little Soundware box, and you can find pictures of it, this red box. No pretty graphics, nothing, but that was the nature of the times, that said we're going to, for whatever that price was, I can't remember, it wasn't cheap, give you access to every sound that you could possibly need in your DAW. Wasn't my cup of meat, but I know, as I said before, some people were quite popular. The promise now is similar, and I've deliberately chosen a picture from the site, the main page spiel, which is quite similar to that of Addictive Drums, where they're showing you the studio, and as though these pictures give you the impression that you're going to get all this magic inside this box. You get a lot of illusion inside the box. You have to decide whether that's an okay illusion, a reasonable compromise, or whether it's an illusion that obscures your ability to step beyond. I am of the personal feeling that it is more the latter than the former. But they give us the impression that now with Sample Tank, we could make everything in our song in the one box. It's a pretty big claim, and while in a certain way it's supportable, in a certain other way, like I say, they create this illusion that I think becomes a fog against the wider world. And that fog, I think, will become a barrier between being... It's probably not fair, but it comes to mind. You think of Ross in Friends, playing his very bizarre music. I think it was on a Casio, and wondering why people didn't rightly get him. I think this is going to be that sort of barrier between you and what I've noted as the Iron Maiden status of being able to kick it with anybody and everybody in the world. In terms of price, yes, what I've got here is a custom shop. So that's this one here. It is free, and they gild the lily with 50 instruments. But in reality, it's often half to a third of that, because a lot of those instruments, like bass, lead, pads, sweeps, they're all actually the same instrument. There are a few variations on how they've processed them with their effects, but they're the same instrument. So 50 is technically correct. There are 50 patches, but are there 50 instruments? No, not at all. And as I said, there are some glaring holes in what is available. Then you've got, obviously, the purchasing options. So 150, which has, well, they say 2,000 instruments, over 30 gig of sounds, 25 gig of all new sounds. What does it matter to you whether they're new or old? The sounds in purity are a million years old, but they just are what they are. Especially if we believe this picture that's underneath, where, oh look, that's like a million years old. That's like a million years old. That's older than Methuselah. The saxophone, well, that guy's more than dead. So the sense that new sounds to be more exciting is, again, it's hyperbole that they are being enthusiastic. Now, it is fair that they be enthusiastic in their marketing, but you also have to understand how to interpret such marketing. Sample Tank 4, the full version, is then $300, over 100 gigabytes of carefully balanced samples. I don't even know what that means. So 30 gig, they've stopped telling us how many instruments. Oh, a total of 6,000 sounds. That you're just getting more stuff. You can actually read lists. To be very fair, they do actually give you lists of what's in there, but of course you can't hear them because there's such a limited sense. And what I perceive is that the sounds are all rather similar. they all kind of sound the same as each other. That's their careful balancing, no doubt. And then, of course, there is the max, where for $500 you can have more stuff. By the time we get to the $500, which is where they're really encouraging you to be, obviously, then we really should be asking, seeing we're up in that kind of money, what about Contact? What about UVI's Falcon? What about Omnisphere? What about Reason? Which all are majoring in quite large sound banks, but huge amounts of versatility in the engine, which this doesn't have. It doesn't have that kind of versatility, either in sound quality or in engine. The sound quality is nice, and that's one of its problems, that everything's rounded off to be so incredibly safe, which is going to cause you problems later, because you will find that your mixes are hard to do. But nonetheless, they make their offer really quite clear, and they do give you a thing that you can try to understand the cut of their jib. So fair enough in that sense. Good and bad, I've covered a lot of already, but we will put it up and be clear. So on the positive, the sounds are okay, but as I'm saying, they rely on having a certain sound. Everything has a certain sound. When you first play it and hear it, sounds kind of good and warm and nice and like, oh, that's good. But the problem is, that's what every sound sounds like. They have a certain sonic footprint. It's almost like they've gone through and EQ'd out anything that might be a challenge for anybody. And the reality is that mixing is about finding uniqueness, and if your sounds already have that uniqueness stripped, it's hard to get anything to cut the mix because everything sounds the same already. So the sounds are okay, and overall it looks pretty, which we will get into. The bad is that it is very limited, obviously, in the demo version, extremely limited, and so much so that I don't think it gives you a fair sense of what the overall instrument is probably going to be capable of. But I've been in the game long enough to have a sense of, look, I think this is what it's going to be like. I listened to demos on their site after already thinking, I think every sound in here is very samey. And I felt like all those mixes, even where supposedly done by other people, they all sounded the same. And you might be like, oh, but that's great because it's pro sound band. And it's like, okay, but as a professional, that's not what I want to hear come up. When somebody, band sends me something to be mixed, I want those sounds to all be unique and interesting. Not bad, but unique and interesting. If they're all this kind of perfect margarine smooth, I know we're really going to struggle to get a striking mix, because they're going to expect that their song comes back all kinds of amazing with like things that make us go, ooh, and of course they won't be there because there's nothing to work with. It's gone already. The mixing and workflow is somewhat cramped, but particularly the mixing. Now, in many ways, you shouldn't be mixing on board, but the idea that I'm taking as a premise based on what they seem to tell us is that, we should be able to do everything on board their box. It's cramped, and there are some serious downsides with what they give. While I said as a positive it looks pretty, that's going to make people feel positive about the program, good on them, clever marketing. The downside is that in reality, a lot of that prettiness covers some real flaws, which I think ultimately, well, for me, still puts Sample Tank in the not my bag. But I'm not the guy who's going to go out and buy a Yamaha Portasound, however good the price, or a Casio Tone Bank. Where I had a Casio, it was in their professional range. Yes, it was in a very affordable professional range, but it was a serious synthesizer. So serious that Vince Clarke had something like 10 of them piled up and did a lot of his work on them. Vince Clarke being Depeche Mode, Yazoo, Erasure. If you are like, who the hell's that? Is one of the most important names in synth pop. Let's have a little bit of a look at the device. Trying to be as open-minded as possible. Okay. Sort of sounds nice, but there's something awfully flat and uninvolved in this sound. If you want a comparison, find the video where I reviewed the Ossa. Now, fair enough, there's a fair price difference, but that's a lovely sounding piano. They're both sampled. This is not lovely, I am sorry to say. And we'll look a little bit more over that and how the sound can be improved, but how it becomes its own either noose or fog around that separates you into the sort of Casio tone bank world rather than the Iron Maiden world. You have to ultimately make your own decision on this. So we've got various screens, and this gets painful. You've got the one screen where you can see everything that's there set to play. Pile things up. That's an awful mix and was never meant to be done that way. So we've got the ability to rack things up. We can use up to 16 instruments, either pile them all on top of each other, or as you've seen, run this in multi-timbral, which is that we can have each one of these being a discrete MIDI channel, or any combination thereof. Like I could have the first 3 all assigned to MIDI channel 1, and then 2, 3, 4, 5, what have you. Any combination thereof. So it's versatile enough in that sense, but that is the nature of a multi-timbral instrument when done remotely properly. You've got key range stuff, which is if you're wanting to do splits. So piano on the bottom and strings on the top if we want to do, or piano and strings on the bottom and the synth on top. That's for live work. Maybe this would be okay for live work, but I don't do live work. There is then this mixer. The mixer kind of looks cool, cute, in its own way, but it's sort of pokey and uncomfortable to work in, bearing in mind a real DAW. They're your main views. There's some other bits and pieces I'm just not going to get into. There is the ability to modify instruments. If we want to access one of the others, then we can slide through here and choose what we want. But that's not actually handling my MIDI, so I have to go here. Actually, that will solve that. As you see, you've kind of got to bounce backwards and forwards sometimes to do things. And then they tell you how great the synth section is, but I couldn't really work out without reading the manual. Remember, reading the manual is not part of the brief for this. Deliberately, it's part of the not brief. Won't do that. Software should show itself. It's not as simple as most other samplers, Contact or whatever, where you can just grab a sample and throw it in here. Or at least it didn't seem to be from loading and what have you. It was obtuse. Maybe if I did the drag and drop, and quite honestly, I don't remember. I remember once many, many years ago loading a sample into this when they were touting how amazing their engine was and sort of walking away going, okay, right. But there is the ability to do a certain amount of synth control-y stuff in here. Filters are okay. From the knobs, as you hear, quite steppy, but from within their own internal automation, not. How that will go if we automated this control, I didn't actually check. I've heard worse filters, but they will become a little limited over time. Yeah, you've got different slopes, but they don't really impart a different character. They just become a little blunter, which is sort of fine. But comparing to high-end things, you know, if we're looking at the $500 package going, okay, I'm going to get this to rule the world, then this engine up against Contact, Falcon, any of those sorts of things is just, it's not the same level. And of course, none of the amazing wavetable additive stuff from Hallian, which is again in the same price arena by the time you're going all in. So there is a synthesis panel, but it is quite limited. This is the bit that will excite people, that you can then put things through these effects and they look so bubblegum. But the problem is they are bubblegum. They don't sound bad, but they sound the same. And they are hard to use. There is a reason why things were designed this way back in the 60s and 70s, because each little component was expensive. If you wanted to build good quality thing, a blob, like this channel strip here, that channel alone was worth a lot of money because you couldn't just use a 2-cent resistor, because a 2-cent resistor was going to sound like, well, not very good. So every component was expensive, meaning that where you might have wanted lots of knobs for your EQ, it was A, going to be very hard to physically fit them in, because all the components were physically bigger, and B, really hard to actually sell that device, because each strip could be $1,000 or so. I'm just making numbers up, but just to give you a sense of it, it'd be like, can I really afford 4 of those? Was a real issue. There are quite a few of these that you can drop in, and at least here, compared to the mix box, I think it's called, you've got access to all of them. If you download the mix box for the free or the custom store version, you get virtually nothing. But here you do seem to get access to everything, but it's a false kind of everything. These are very pretty to look at, but while they sound good in a way, they also somehow have this sound that makes everything sound the same. So again, it's almost like they've gone through and said, oh, no, nobody likes hearing that frequency, let's just magically disappear it. So everything that everybody does here will seem to sound good. Okay, fair enough. And then there is an arpeggiator. Never my favourite thing, but it's there, it's kind of cool. There are a couple of different modes, which I really didn't look into. But this I see as a marketing strength, but a practical weakness. These things are hard to use. While they can say, oh, but you're getting an 1176. No, you're not. You're absolutely not. You're getting something that's styled to look like an 1176. But that's like me putting on a blonde wig and some leotards and calling myself Olivia Newton-John. Sorry? Too early? Tasteless? Yeah, it's not a particularly great thing. Yes, they will go all about their T-Rex and T-Rax and all this kind of stuff and all their credibility, but the sound is not, it's not good, or the problem is that it's always good, and that's not right. So these things will be more confusing to use than they should be, by a long shot. And while they sort of sound cool, they will actually stop you from really learning how to use proper, better tools, because all this is, remember, a fog of mystification. And yeah, I took the mix box because I wanted to understand what these were like a lot better. Took them out, put them in Reason, put them up against synths, and then looked, it's like, oh wow, that's really nice. It's like, okay, maybe I'm being a little uncool about this. And then I realized whatever I did, it always sounded the same. Pulled out Reason devices, and while it wasn't possible to duplicate certain things because I couldn't understand exactly what their architecture was, there was nothing to stop me from getting a very similar workable sound. Plus, I had more control over the sound that I built by hand, using essentially matching devices to the ones that were available in the free version. And it didn't have that stuck in always sounding a certain way. So please be very cautious. While these are incredibly pretty, they really are, they are also hard to use and will see you get more confused in your attempts to mix, and therefore probably more likely to make mixes that fail. I don't see how it's very easy to make mixes that really succeed in the box here. That's a big problem. I did not feel that it would be hard to make mixes that succeeded if we were staying 100% in Alien. UVI I haven't been able to use, but I can't see why we shouldn't be able to make decent mixes with the process that I used here in that kind of environment. So this makes a kind of a promise, but I don't think it delivers on it. It furfies it with illusion. And that's what puts me off personally. But I know a lot of people are going to like that illusion because they're going to go, oh, but look, I've got this channel strip from, I don't even know what's that supposedly from, oh, and an 1176 and a vintage EQ. EQ's EQ is EQ, 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 EQ. That's what it is. If you get to the point of feeling that you want to add some saturation, then soft tube knobs, damn good. Put that on everything. I've got videos on saturation. I've gone through quite a few. Even just that freebie alone, or Voxengo's tube amp, again a freebie. Put that on at the end of every effect chain, and on a bus and on your masters, and the ABs that you'll hear in those reviews is just like, oh, okay. You don't need this kind of bubblegum looking prettiness to actually have good sound. If you are going down that path, then again, my 2 cents is the Hornet analog stage. That's on everything now. And there was the G-Sonic tape, which is tending to go on everything now as well. So I'm putting analog stage on the desk insert type things, and the tape on the master. Got to watch out on distortion on that little fella, but it sounds great without the strange bubblegum but obtuse, hard to use of these. So the mixing does not get a thumbs up from me at all, other than how pretty it looks. But I don't think it should look pretty. I think that it should be functional. That's sort of really it. So I'm giving my impressions. This is my job as a reviewer, to give my impressions. Overall, the product has access to, well, they say 50 sounds. You can narrow down to looking at particular things, but let's just change this. Okay, so actually I'll just put that in solo. Now I've got to remember, okay, how do I set up my MIDI channel? Oh, it's here. There. That's not 4 different instruments. They're simply changing the effects. And that's not terrible. And in this case, seeing it's a precision bass, that's the one bass to rule them all. Good enough for Steve Harris of Iron Maiden. But to suggest that they are separate instruments is, well, it's stretching the boundaries just a tiny, tiny bit, because that's one instrument. Brass, you just get one brass section. Vibes, this was the one that... While that's not a bad compromise for electric piano, it's not an electric piano. Drums, there were 3 kits. And, well, seeing I'd just come out of doing Addictive Drums, bear in mind that's a couple $100 on its own, this kit just did not match. Ethnic, a kalimba, UK. And again, four processed kalimbas. Guitar, there is the steel string F, which has this weird habit of bouncing all over the stereo spectrum. Whoever came up with that idea. And a strummer, which, to be honest, I didn't put time into trying to... Oh, okay, I think you have to press... It does tell you how to use it, I think. That's probably a better use of that. Stop! Than the solo version of the sound, because it sounded really... But notice no electric guitars. And simply going, oh, well, we'll solve that by putting a distortion onto the acoustic guitar. Oh, no, it doesn't work. Again, a few. But all so very same. So they're the same sample, just with a few different effects, as though that's going to change things. Piano... we have above. Actually, I was going to show you through that a little bit more to have a sense of the sounds. Strings, these are... they just run out. They're not looped. They're an interesting sound. There is an arpeggiated version. But that is not the equal of Spitfire's BBC SO Discovery, which is free, gives you sections of violins, 1 violins, 2 violas, cello, lots of cellos, funny sounding bassoon. I think it's the bassoon that sounds funny. It's a bassoon, clarinet, or oboe sounds funny, but nonetheless actually sounds like the real thing. This does not. Stop. See, all the same thing. And that would be okay if they were bonus above the 50 instruments, but they're not. There's no difference. They're not usable. Voices, this gets annoying, the choosing things. It really does get annoying. At least they loop. But we know, again, that with the Spitfire's originals, their epic choir, it's not the same sound as this. I mean, that it's not that I wouldn't use that in the right situation. It's just, it's not the same. And woodwinds, apparently brass is now a woodwind. Sorry to be narky, but it just kind of is like, oh, okay, yep, that sounds like an oboe. So the extremely limited sound set will be a problem. This is what I was going to show. Stop it. This grand piano. Having to remember how to get places is super annoying. Okay, you can open things from different places. The piano comes, strangely, with quite a few things running, and this has been meddled with, so no need to write and say you change that. That is a pretty thin-sounding piano for a supposedly pro thing. The way they've fattened it up is interesting, but part of the problem that I talk about with this illusion or fog that stands between you being stuck in sort of Casio Porter sound and being able to achieve Iron Maiden. Okay, channel strip, they're doing a little bit of EQing, nothing wrong with that. Then there's this, I don't fully understand what this does, but it's acoustic resonance. Everything about this screams impulse response, and anyone who knows me knows that me and impulse responses are not fans. To me, they're just bunny ears on an Instaham camera. Yes, it does change the sound a little bit, but this sound needs it. So that's one way of kind of increasing the sense that this might have some life. Piano lid. While that's not an uncommon thing to have in good quality piano libraries, it doesn't bring any life. It changes timbre slightly, and then we've got another impulse response. Let's pull that one back a little. And adds far too longer. Is that on? No, now it's on. So it's this really weird sounding typical impulse response. Yes, on the surface it makes the sounds better in a direct A-B, but it feels very weird in a mix. And then they've got another reverb on top of that. And while they're not terrible reverbs, they're not versatile reverbs. So we can get this to a point where it's like, oh, okay, hidden inside a mix. We can get away with that. It's not Chopin, but we can improve this. But you can hear that the sound relies on this, not on its inherent amazefulness. Compare and contrast that again with the Ossa that I reviewed, and okay, price difference, but that's a good sample set. Turn off any doohickery, which there was little to none in there, and you've got a great sounding piano that you can then take into a mix and make do whatever you want it to do. I know because I have used that in a mix. It appears in The Eternal Eternity of Mechanism. There is a track built around a rubato freeform random wandery of the Ossa. I could not have achieved that result with this, or with, in all fairness, with Purity. There is just a massive difference in quality of sound, and the whole thing with Sample Tank is that they rely so much on these effects to achieve their sound, and it's a problem because, as I keep saying, these sounds are designed to create illusion. They are designed to be like a fog that stops you from seeing the difference between where you are and where Iron Maiden is. And that's okay if you want to make it easy on yourself and have somebody else make all the decisions, despite the fact that a lot of those decisions are going to see you trapped behind that fog. But the moment you get to the point of going, it's time for me to step over and actually, throw my wrecking ball in with the Iron Maiden kind of thing, then you're going to have difficulties. As I said, if I was sent a backing that was all, say, this kind of stuff, I would be thinking from the beginning, I think I'm going to struggle to make a great mix out of this. Yeah, I can balance the things, but there'll always be a difficulty of how to separate the sounds. If you shuttle back, I'm not going to go reopening it, but if you shuttle back to the to those revoices from the beginning, it'll all be in chapters. Have a listen to and get a sense of how much separation is there between these instruments, especially where I A-B between the original compositions, the original mix, and the Sample Tank thing. You're probably going to go, ooh, there's a lot less separation. Yes, it sounds kind of lounge music, nice and smooth and warm, but the separation between any two instruments and location is just not there. And that's the big thing that stops me from being able to be like, you know what, there's a lot of cool in this. If we were to say just use the samples and throw away all their mixed stuff, or use it very, very carefully and mix properly, it would be a little better, but then I would be, why not just use Purity? Or, again, why not get Contact or UVI's Falcon or Omnisphere or Halion or any of those sorts of things that are designed to be more on the Iron Maiden side of that foggy divide than the Casio Tone Bank side of the divide. That really was my final words, which is that yes, interesting, yes, very pretty effect devices, but I don't think that it's the right way to go for, well, ultimately anybody. Because by the time you've spent the money on this in the first few years or whatever, until you realize that there's that barrier, you've then got to spend the money again. Why not just spend the money right in the first place? You could mount an argument, and it is fair, perhaps, to mount an argument to say, oh, well, it's just beginner kit. So if they started with pro stuff, the person wouldn't understand it and they'd drown in it because it doesn't sound as nice. Okay, I will concede that that is a valid argument. But if somebody is intending to become Iron Maiden, as opposed to Thingo from Friends with his Casio, then you need to start on that side of the divide. There is no real jumping over that divide, especially if you don't realize that there is a difference on either side of that divide. So I would, again, answer that by simply saying, well, if you start by learning bad habits, how are you going to unlearn them? This is the first thing that Yoda has to do with Luke. Unlearn. And this is why in martial arts, of which Jediism is, that's why they take those kids really young, so that they don't have to go through an unlearn process. And so I sort of think, well, yeah, you could spend $500 here, because that's probably what you will have spent on this by the time you get to the point where maybe you realize, oh, there's an invisible barrier here between me and Iron Maiden, to sort of say, hey, I'm going to now spend another $500. Not exactly a rave review. There are positives about the product, but I question whether it's really the right way to go if you are otherwise thinking that you would be trying to be Iron Maiden rather than somebody with a Casio Tone Bank. Then it's probably just not the right path. If you have any questions, not about IK, please, because that's to them. I'm not IK, obviously not paid by, for, or necessarily even endorsed by after this. IK Multimedia, go ask them those questions, but just sort of broader questions about the subject matter, or my impressions of the instrument that maybe you didn't understand. Ask them on down below, preferably after hitting subscribe. There is also higherhertz.com with a different stream of information. And of course, you can always get your sticky fingers on Hertz Delay, which is a freebie over there. And I do fully approve of for mixing, probably because I made it, but nonetheless, there's a lot of material if you're looking through there that is about how to really step out and mix on your own. So, most important thing is try things out, get what works for you, genuinely works, but is going to allow you to grow with it, and have a good day.